Have you ever wondered what it looks like when an entire continent just catches fire? Between 1820 and 1848, a revolutionary fever swept across Europe. And we're not talking about just one uprising. Nope. This was a chain reaction, a series of rebellions that threatened to burn an entire world order to the ground. So let's get into it and see how this all went down.
It's a wild image, right? A continent on fire. But honestly, that's exactly what it felt like. These weren't just a few isolated protests. The spirit of revolution was described as being, well, endemic. It spread like a virus from one city to the next. So, what was the fuel for this massive continental firestorm?
To really get what happened, you have to picture Europe as a giant pressure cooker. See, after Napoleon was finally defeated, the old kings and emperors tried to shove the genie back in the bottle. They wanted to turn back the clock and pretend the French Revolution never happened. But, well, you can't unring a bell.
Okay, so this slide really lays it all out. It's a total clash of worlds. On one side, you've got the old world. Absolute kings, a rigid social order, basically the because I said so style of government. This was the conservative system they put back in place at the Congress of Vienna. But on the other side, whoa, you've got these electrifying new ideas that the French Revolution had unleashed. Liberalism, which is all about constitutions and rights, and nationalism, this crazy idea that people who share a culture should have their own country. You can just feel the tension, right? A collision was pretty much inevitable.
And this quote just hits the nail on the head. This was the massive problem for all those kings and emperors. No matter how hard they tried to stamp out these ideas, the desire for change was literally everywhere. It was in the air. People saw it as a spontaneous contagion, a feeling that could just ignite entire populations who were totally fed up. The pressure was definitely building.
So the pressure cooker is hissing, it's about to blow. Now let's talk about the first sparks that really started to fly in the 1820s and 30s. This wasn't the main explosion, not yet, but these early revolts showed just how flammable the whole situation had become. And just look how fast this thing moved. It kicks off in 1820 around the Mediterranean. We're talking Spain, Naples, Portugal. Then Greece starts fighting for its independence. A decade later, boom, another revolution in Paris takes down the king. And other people are watching, because right after that, Belgium breaks away from the Netherlands to become its own country. You can literally see the dominoes starting to topple, one right after the other.
You know, sometimes those dominoes fall in ways you would never, ever expect. The revolution that kicked off in Portugal in 1820, it didn't just stay in Europe. It sent a massive shockwave all the way across the Atlantic that would completely change the future of South America.
Okay, so check this out. The revolutionaries in Portugal were liberals, right? But they also wanted to tighten their grip on their huge colony, Brazil. So they demand their king, who was chilling in Brazil, to come home to Lisbon. And then they try to basically demote Brazil back to being just a colony. This backfired spectacularly. It was the final push the Brazilians needed. In 1822, Brazil declares its independence. Just think about that. A revolution in Europe directly led to the birth of a new nation across the ocean.
So if the 1820s and 30s were the sparks, then 1848 was the inferno. This was the year the pressure cooker finally just exploded and nearly the entire continent went up in revolutionary flames. 1848. Historians have a name for it, the Spring of Peoples. It was like someone hit the fast-forward button on history. All the tension that had been building for decades just erupted in a matter of months. It was absolute chaos.
And what was the trigger? What was the one thing that was like throwing a lit match into a puddle of gasoline? You guessed it, Paris. Again, in February of 1848, the French kicked out their king and declared a republic. The news spread like lightning, and it ignited a firestorm in
Vienna, the very heart of the old conservative empire. Berlin, the capital of Prussia. Rome, Budapest, where Hungarian nationalists were demanding their freedom. Suddenly, uprisings were erupting everywhere in the capitals of the most powerful empires. People were demanding constitutions, freedom of the press, their own nations. The old system was just crumbling everywhere, all at once.
And if you had to pick one person who represented everything the revolutionaries were fighting against, it would be this guy, Prince Clemens von Metternich of Austria. For 30 years, this man had been the puppet master of the conservative system. He was the guy pulling the strings to keep all these new, dangerous ideas in check. He was the guardian of the kings and the #1 enemy of revolution.
And then, in March 1848,
As angry crowds swarmed the streets of his own city, Vienna, the great Metternich was forced to run for his life and flee into exile. The fall of this one man was just huge. It was a massive symbol. It was like the architect of the prison had just been overthrown by the prisoners. It really felt like a new world was dawning.
So, the revolutionaries had won. Metternich was gone, new constitutions were on the way, new nations were being born. It looked like a total victory. But the story's not over. A fatal crack was about to show up, right in the heart of the revolution itself.
Here was the problem. The revolution wasn't one big happy family. It was made up of different groups who wanted different things. You had the liberal middle class, the bourgeoisie. They wanted political rights, sure, but they really wanted to protect their property. And then you had the workers in the cities. They wanted something more. They weren't just after a political revolution. They wanted a social one to fight poverty and inequality. And the second the middle class got what they wanted, they got terrified of what the workers might demand next.
So what happened? The revolution split apart. The liberals, now scared of losing what they'd gained, basically switched sides. They started making deals with the old rulers and called in the armies to restore order. And the kings, who had been on the verge of losing everything, saw their chance. In a wild move, the Tsar of Russia actually sent his army to help Austria crush the Hungarian independence movement. The comeback was swift, it was brutal, and most of those early victories were just wiped off the map.
So by 1849, the fires were out. The kings were back on their thrones. The revolutionaries were either in jail, in exile, or worse. On the surface, it looked like a total crushing failure. But was it? Let's talk about the real legacy of this insane period.
I mean, this is the big question, isn't it? If you just look at the scoreboard in 1849, the answer seems like a pretty clear yes. Most of the new governments were gone, and the dreams of 1848 had been smashed by military force. But that's not the whole story, not even close. And this, right here, is the key takeaway from all of this. Armies could crush the rebels, sure, but they couldn't kill the ideas. The ideas of liberalism and nationalism were out, and they weren't going back in the box. The Spring of Peoples proved that the old world of absolute kings was living on borrowed time. So even though it failed in the short run, 1848 basically set the agenda for the next 100 years. It was the spark that would eventually lead to a unified Italy, a unified Germany, and the Europe we know today. The revolts themselves may have been crushed, but the change they started, that was permanent.